Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good evening from Istanbul, Turkey. Welcome on behalf of our university, Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. This is the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, Third International Conference on Islamophobia. This year's topic, examining the global war on terror, challenges, policies, and consequences. This is the last session for today. We have had fantastic panels this last conference, very blunt and to the point. We've had very good feedback, and I anticipate that tonight will be no exception. We have an all-star cast on our panel, and I'm delighted to introduce our director, Dr. Sami Al-Aryan, who has been a lifelong activist and fighter on behalf of Palestinian rights, and we are honored to have him as our Palestinian scholar here in Turkey. Dr. Al-Aryan, welcome.
Thank you, Obaid, and thank you, everyone, and welcome everybody to the session 7. So good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We're very pleased that you are with us. Unfortunately, our moderator wasn't able to join us today. She was from South Africa. We were hoping that she would. She was from the Afro-Middle East Center, who is one of our partners. However, I will introduce the speakers, but also shortly, the moderator will join us, Ofais Khan, who is also a senior research associate here at CIGA. I'm very excited, in fact, about today's session. This is one of the I believe, important sessions because it talks about the politics of Islamophobia within Muslim majority countries, particularly autocratic regimes. Actually, the session title is Autocratic Regimes and the Politics of Islamophobia. And as Ubaid said, we really have very distinguished and outstanding presenters and speakers here. Each one will talk about a different part of this session. First, we're going to have Professor David Miller. David is from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, and he will speak about the case of the United Arab Emirates and how it has been leading the efforts within the region, and with that, embracing Islamophobia and Islamophobic policies. David is an investigative researcher interested in the concentrations of power in society and how they might be democratized and made accountable. He works on corporate as well as state power and how they are reproduced, in particular through policy and expert processes and via social movements from above and below. He has many publications, and of course, he has been in the news more recently because of the attacks, the unjustified attacks on him because of his stance, because of his principled stance. And of course, we honor him and we stand by him. Our second presenter will talk about the case of Egypt is Yusri Morsi, who is a professor at the La Trobe University in Australia. Yusri completed his PhD at the University of Melbourne in political science and Islamic studies. He looks at contemporary liberal thought and its dealing of the so-called Muslim question. His research engaged with a broad range of critical race theories. Dr. Morsi is also a columnist for The Guardian Australia and author of Radical Skin, Moderate Masks, a book on the racialization of Islam by looking at the political problem Muslims pose as citizens of a liberal state during the so-called war in terror. Our third presenter, who will join us shortly, is a well-known intellectual here in Turkey, and he will be speaking about Islamophobia in the Arab and Muslim worlds. He is Professor Yasin Aktay from University Ankara Yildirim Bayezid in Ankara, Turkey. Professor Yasin received his bachelor in 1990, his master's degree in 93, and PhD in 97 from the Department of Sociology at Middle East Technical University in Ankara. His course went through the different succession in academia, from assistant to associate to professor in the field of sociology. And he's been also a professor at many institutions and universities around Turkey, and he's a well-known writer here in Turkey. He has columns 2-3 times a week. He has many books. He edited many books. And of course, he appears on many programs as well as interviews. Our last speaker, but not least, is Dr. Osama Al-Azami from the University of Oxford in England, and he will be speaking about the role of the ulama in enabling Islamophobia. And Dr. Osama, who I had the privilege to know for several years now, is a very young intellectual and bright scholar. He's a lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Oxford, as I said. He read his bachelor degree in Arabic and Islamic studies at Oxford also, and his master's degree and PhD in Near Eastern studies at Princeton University in the United States. His dissertation explored Islamic political thought in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Alongside his university studies, he has also pursued Islamic studies in seminarial context across 3 continents. In addition to his academic writing, he's been a frequent commentator on many programs. So I'm very pleased to have our speakers today addressing this topic, and each one of them will have about 18 to 20 minutes. And as I said, our moderator for the session, I just introduced the speakers, will be Awais Khan. Awais is a senior research associate here. So take it over, and we'll start with Professor Miller. David, welcome. Please unmute yourself before starting.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm sorry, I'm a bit croaky. I'm losing my voice, but we should manage. So thanks again. I'm looking very much forward to this session because of the range of different topics there are on Islamophobia in Muslim-speaking or Muslim-majority countries, a topic which is quite rarely examined, I think, and of great note in recent times. I'm going to talk about the work which I have done on the UAE and its role in promoting Islamophobia. But I want to put that into a bit of a context in relation to the role of states more generally in producing Islamophobia. So in 2017, I co-edited a book with some colleagues called What is Islamophobia? And in that we advanced the idea that there were what we called 5 pillars of Islamophobia. And I don't propose to go through all of those pillars, but I just wanted to point out the first pillar, what we said was the backbone of Islamophobia, meaning in the UK. And that was the state, the forces of the state, in particular, the counter-terrorism apparatus of the British state is the key driver of Islamophobic actions day by day in this country, in particular through the interaction between the police and the intelligence services and various other government bodies and Muslim people in this country, and people who might be thought to be Muslim. So our general perspective is that there are other social movements that encourage Islamophobia, the New Conservatives, parts of the Zionist movement, the far right, and to some extent parts of the left or different parts of the left, but that the main way in which Islamophobia is instantiated and reproduced every day is through the state. Now, when we think about this in relation to other states, we can see the same kind of thing in, I guess, the US, in other Western countries, in France, Germany, in Spain, in Italy as well. And I suppose the same would be the case in a country like the UAE. But the reason that I want to talk about the UAE is not just because it's a state, and I don't just want to talk about it in relation to it being a state, but to take a wider lens on this and to look at this, the state, the UAE state, in relation to not just its own internal politics, but in relation to transnational and global geopolitics, the relationship between the UAE as a state in its attempts to pursue an Islamophobic agenda in the last almost a decade now, and its relationships with other states. So when we say that the state is the backbone, we're talking about it in relation to a particular national context. Of course, there is the international context, and the international context where states interact with each other is perhaps a more interesting and varied picture. I wanted to hone in on the particular case of the UAE, since I've done some research on this, including something you may have seen, the UAE lobby, Subverting British Democracy, ? Which was published in 2018. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but also update some of the story in relation to it. Now, it's a curious thing, isn't it? So when you say that Muslim majority state, even an autocratic Muslim majority state, is engaged in performing or producing or promoting Islamophobia, often people will sort of not quite get what you're talking about. They will say, well, surely it's Western white states that do that. And of course, it is predominantly, and they're the main ones doing it. But the UAE is a particular case which, since the Arab Spring, has adopted a strategy whereby its main foreign policy role is to promote Islamophobia, to take on its enemies, as it would see them, both its internal enemies inside the country and its external enemies, which it sees as the same sets of organizations, and to pursue what is essentially a kind of a counter-revolutionary approach to the Arab Spring. When the Arab Spring hit, they were concerned that the internal opposition to their regime, Al-Islah, the group associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, was actually a threat to them and could potentially overthrow their regime. Now, that was never a possibility, but they were paranoid about this, and they threw, as is well known, 94 people who they thought were Al-Islam members into jail, and they launched a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood as they saw it, and also started to adopt this wider strategy of pursuing the Muslim Brotherhood all around the world, so that they would, for example, in relation to both the US and the UK, they would try and influence both UK and US foreign policy and also domestic policy in relation to issues to do with the Muslim Brotherhood or groups they thought were associated or claimed to believe that were associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So just to take one very clear example of this, I mean, I'm seeing this in a context where it's often widely thought that given that the US is the global hegemon, the most powerful nation on earth, and notwithstanding what tendencies there might be to undermine that power, that really, as the phrase often is used in relation to Israel, the tail does not wag the dog. Small nations do not influence the policies, internal or external, of the great powers, in particular the global hegemon, the US. Now, in general, that might be a reasonable argument, but in the specifics of the relationship between the UAE and the British government in this period, it's not true. There may be, at a larger level, relations of power where the UK is more dominant, but it certainly has been the case that the UAE was able to exert influence on the UK through the mechanism of large arms and petrochemical contracts that the UAE threatened Britain would not be signed if the British government didn't do what the UAE wanted. And what the UAE wanted was a British government investigation into the role of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization in the UK. Now, all of us here know that that's simply a preposterous way of framing things, but that was the way that they framed it. The MB is a terrorist organization. It's almost like a coherent global force, and it needs to be pursued everywhere. And therefore, the British government had to introduce an inquiry into the Muslim Brotherhood, and they did it because of the UAE government threatened to withhold contracts from BAE Systems, the arms company, and from BP, famously the Anglo-American oil company, as was Anglo-Iranian oil company, sorry, as was. And so, in that example, and there are many more examples, the UAE, the small Gulf autocracy, was able to exert pressure and influence on the British government in its foreign and domestic policies to try to clamp down on the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, there are many other examples of this in this period where they clamped down on Isla after 94, and they started then to target Qatar. As you all know, there's a boycott of Qatar because of its alleged support for terrorism, which of course any of us who know a little bit about these matters know that that wasn't really what was happening. What was really happening was that the Qatari regime was supporting democratic forces across the Middle East, and the UAE was petrified that they might come home to roost in the UAE, and so therefore Qatar was the target. And of course, it played out in the Syrian conflict, and it played out in a number of different other conflicts where the UAE was on one side and the Qataris were on the other side. It's not always the case in all conflicts, but in this case it was. Now, what we see there is the UAE emerging as a regional leader in counter-revolution, essentially, and a regional leader in part of what became known as the tripartite alliance. Now, that's an alliance between the Israelis on the one hand, the UAE on the other, and the third partner, of course, the Saudis. And the Saudis are still moving towards this quite rapidly, but it takes time to do that, to moving towards a very strongly Islamophobic policy as part of this tripartite alliance in which the UAE plays a leading role in working very closely with the Israelis at a lobbying level, but also in terms of trying to normalize relations with Israel. So when we did our report in 2018, we mentioned this process of normalizing relationships. Of course, since then it's moved on at a pace, and there is now a strong move towards normalization across a number of countries, some of which are being threatened to do so by the UAE and by other countries. And so you've got this normalization process, but you've also got a kind of a collaborative lobbying process. So just to take some examples, many of the lobby firms which are used by Israel or by the Zionist movement in the UK and US are also used by the UAE, funded by the UAE. The most obvious classic example is the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the ultra-Zionist think tank in the US, which, as the Al Jazeera program on the lobby revealed, is effectively an arm of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel. And the reason I say it that way is because that's what was said of it by Sima Vaknin-Gil, the managing director of the MSA at the time, and it's undercover footage. Now, the UAE also funds the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And there's a very strong collaborative relationship there between the Israelis and the UAE, and the Saudis, strange as it may seem, as a junior partner in this relationship. We also see in the attempt to boycott Qatar, the attempt to have the World Cup withdrawn from Qatar, various harebrained schemes being dreamt up by the UAE and its lobbyists to have a World Cup all the way around the Middle East or in different places. And this is an effort they've put some very significant sums of money and activity into, hosting conferences by front groups in the US and the UK, working very closely with neoconservative think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society, for example, in this country, and indeed with the famous Qatari dissidents like Khalid al-Hayl, who of course works very closely with the UAE, although I think formally they sort of deny that there's any relationship between them. So what we see here is effectively, I think, a new emergence of autocratic Middle Eastern Muslim majority states, in particular the ones I'm talking about here, the UAE and the Saudis, and of course they've had influence in Egypt and other places, getting into a coalition to pursue the same kinds of interests which are being pursued by the war on terror in the UK and in the US, and indeed by NATO around the world. So it may seem strange that the UAE is engaged in this, but you can see, I think if I've described this at all clearly, that it's to do partly with their own internal interests in making sure there's no democracy in the UAE, and also partly by their external interests of being in a bloc with other states, the US, the UK, and especially Israel, to push back against the possibility that there might be a widespread democratization across the Middle East. And so I think that's the key thing that we should know here. And just in closing, I would say something about the way in which that has changed recently. So the Biden administration has come into place, and so far it seems to be a little bit less hawkish in some respects, at least, to the Trump administration. And as a result, we've seen recently two of the key architects of the aggressive foreign policy carried out for MBZ by people like Anwar Gargash and Zaki Nasebi, and they have been, I don't know if people have noticed this, but they've been sidelined. They've been given new jobs as advisors to the president, who although he has a formal role of importance, in practice has very little power in the UAE. So the kind of more aggressive posture that those two individuals have been pushing in relation, especially to Muslims and the Muslim Brotherhood over recent years, has been curtailed slightly, in part for public relations reasons. But they have been sidelined effectively, and there's a new attempted, more conciliatory approach coming from the UAE. But it's anyone's guess how long that will last. So I'm going to stop there, and happy to have questions later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. My name is Awais Khan, as Dr. Sami had mentioned earlier. I will be the moderator for this session in the absence of our previous moderator. Next, we have Dr. Morsi from Australia. Dr. Morsi, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Just checking that everybody can hear me okay before I get started.
Yep, I can hear you very well.
Great. Assalamu alaikum to everybody, and extending my appreciation and gratitude by CIGA and everybody else for the invitation to talk about an ever important discussion about the growing influence of Islamophobia, both at a global level, and to potentially deal with the paradox of speaking about Islamophobia as the way it manifests in Muslim majority countries. So I'll be talking about the case of Egypt and a little bit about myself and my background. So I myself am Egyptian, but I live here in Australia, and the majority of my work has been dealing with Islamophobia as a term to help us make sense of the life and struggle of Muslims when they're a minority. And that's important introduction to what I want to do in this talk. Because I think Egypt, as maybe many other different Muslim majority countries provide us, is an opportunity to expand our conceptualization of what Islamophobia is and can do, and what type of technology it employs to inevitably foster, as I will try to conclude, to limit the types of Islam that are possible. So at the heart of my talk, rather than speak, I'm a firm believer that those on the ground, especially those in Egypt, will be much better placed, far better placed to speak about the ins and outs of actors. It's always been one of my gripes that living so far away from home, it's provided some level of privilege to speak back, but also that comes with a price. And one of those prices is sometimes we, by virtue, and it may not be the case in Australia, but definitely in the UK and America possibly, by virtue of belonging to the hegemonic states, we tend to possibly speak over or not listen closely to those on the ground. So one of my aims here is to speak from a positionality that helps me platform certain Egyptian actors, but also think through what it may mean to compare and contrast the definition of Islamophobia that doesn't just center the experiences of minorities, but Muslims globally. And so I want to start basically with a question, and my talk will be basically divided into three parts. I will set the parameters of my discussion as I'm doing now, look at the particularities of Egypt in the middle part of my talk, and then conclude with perhaps a reimagining out loud with all of you and anybody else in the audience about what how we can define Islamophobia and conceptualize it, stretch it, and make it far more workable in the way it is expanding its practice to unfortunately impact everyday Muslims, even in places that we would assume historically are safe for Muslims to practice the array and various different versions of Islam. So underpinning all of this is a question I want to ask, and that is, I mean, what does it seriously mean for us to say that a Muslim majority country such as Egypt can be Islamophobic? Now, the rich, I mean, I don't need to get into the details here, and it's redundant if not obvious, but the rich history of Islam in Egypt as one of its major contributors of culture, one of its hosts of institutions that have advocated both an Islamicate intellectual, cultural tradition, a legalese tradition. How can Egypt, with depending on estimations, anywhere above 80 to 85% Muslim, potentially more, how can we speak about that meaningfully as Islamophobic? Now, we can perhaps describe government or government structures and institutions as Islamophobic. That's one way to answer that question. We could even go a step further and argue that the very conceptualizing of a nation state within the current global order formed by a colonial legacy in and of itself is in the service of Northwestern powers, global North, and that in that one way, it's part of a racialized model economy that we could unpack. So rather than speak about the people, the attitudes, the policies, the very structure itself is set up for the advancement of the Western world economically and politically and otherwise. So that's one way to get around it. But I think when we speak about Egypt as being Islamophobic, we're essentially asking questions about the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, what's happening on the street, what's happening on a government policy, what's happening in the cultural institutions such as media and otherwise. They're establishing a particular narrative and policy and violent policy in order to control the organizing capacity of the Ikhwan. So part of that question about whether or not Egypt is Islamophobic, I think depends and orientates around a definition that we have of Islamophobia. And this is why I think the case of Egypt provides us multiple opportunities. One, to provide an archive, to provide a list, a series of necessary statements out loud, to keep record of what is happening in Egypt. So to not be, to not be naive enough, not be politically naive enough to suggest that Islamophobia is only something that we should be exploring where Muslims are a minority vis-a-vis a non-Muslim majority. So that's one opportunity that provides us. But as mentioned, it also allows us to enter the debate around the context of what Islamophobia means. And I think one of the misfortunes about the literature of Islamophobia, and this perhaps leads back to the conceptual shift that we've had between Orientalism to Islamophobia. Orientalism carried a far more, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I kind of sense it carried a far more echo of a colonial history. And partly because of the successful and seminal work of Edward Said, it tied it back into an East-West ontology, and subsequently within that, a colonial legacy was maintained. Islamophobia seems to me to have taken off both as a concept and a literature, as an idea, particularly post-September 11, to identify not so much the East and the West, but really the East within the West. So really Muslim minorities and their struggles within the West, or the West's struggle to maintain its image of a liberal, tolerant, free society while advocating the various different violences, both at the legal, military, and cultural level during the war on terror. So one of the misfortunate things for me in the current conceptualizing of Islamophobia is, and often it's quite Eurocentric as a term, it's Western-centric. It's typically focusing on the depending on the livelihood and mobility of Muslims in the West, and also often at the expense of Muslims elsewhere. Now, with what's happening in China, that's somewhat expanded, and this is part of the, I think, the importance of this conference when we're speaking about Muslim majority countries and the various different types of states that we have. But within that initial, let's say, genesis and evolution of the term Islamophobia, I also think it orientated around liberalism. And I say misfortune because one of the difficulties is in conceptualizing Islamophobia is that for so many in the public debate, and in particular in the public sphere, and let's say beyond academia and beyond activism and beyond Muslim voices, Islamophobia simply meant the lack of liberalism. So people conceptualized it as Muslims lacking rights, or their rights being curtailed by bigotry and various different forms of democracy. And Islamophobia became the absence of liberal rights, the absence of democracy applied to its Muslim citizens. And that's somewhat problematic, as I'll try to go on to conceptualize in the third part of my talk, because effectively what we're arguing is that Islamophobia is not born out of the Western state, or racism is not a product of various different historical, local, and global forces, but rather is a suspension or a failure of the Western state to live up to its ideals. There's a secondary question about how much of those ideals in and of themselves are racialized and how much of them have ever been applied for them to be supposedly suspended. But that we'll park that debate for a minute, because what I really want to get into, and to repeat the point here, is what's at stake, and the contest being how we define Islamophobia and what it may mean to imagine Islamophobia in effectively an illiberal society, an autocratic society, and to win back a definition that isn't reliant on the idea that it's simply about the absence of democratic rights. Now, that may be an important definition of Islamophobia, which is there, and it's not so much the case that I want to take it off the table entirely, but I think, as mentioned in my opening comments, there's a need to expand, there's a hope to expand the definition to include what I think is an important but somewhat paradoxical question about a Muslim majority being Islamophobic. Now, why would that be paradoxical? So let me move into the second part of my talk and speak about the particularities of Egypt. And I want to just list some generalities here. And again, I'm cautious of not speaking over what's happening on the ground, because Islamophobia has multiple layers of dimensions of what it targets. And above all, there's a psychological registry to the target of Islamophobia, and that is, just continually living one's life, having to tailor, censor, limit one's Islamic expression, and that's really felt at the level, continually being observed by the state. Having to go through that, I think, means that those who are enduring that are far better the place to speak about the kind of banality of Islamophobia's violence. It's rather easy for me, say in Australia, to speak about the broader lashes of Islamophobia without having to endure that embodiedness of being at the crosshairs of Islamophobia. But I do want to focus on these generalities, because I think what's fascinating, and it's mentioned by the previous speaker and others, is that Egypt's adoption of ostensibly America, it's a kind of extension of America's war on terror policy, right? And its narrative. So the Ikhwan is forced, or the Brotherhood is forced into the debate in the same way that Western societies speak about the Islamic / everyday Muslim threat, that there's something peculiar and to the faith, or to the history, or to the people, or the majority of Muslims. There's something within us that leads us to being sensitive to using violence as a political tool, to using terror. Now, how do you convince an Egyptian population that there's something inherent in their, as I said, in the long historical, and remember, Islam, of course, in Egypt is still an honored faith, is still part and parcel of the everyday vernacular, who we are, and speaks to our past and also to our future. So how does one force that war on terror narrative, which in part is the war on terror narrative, as I understand it here, is in part is an attempt to erase as much as possible the geopolitical and colonial legacy of Western and foreign influences in shaping for their own interests Muslim majority countries, Middle East as one instance, and trying to control the violence that comes out of their violence, right? And the best way to do that for them was to construct, as I said, as is the process of racializing. There's something wrong with Muslims, right? There's Bernard Lewis's famous article, The Roots of Muslim Rage. You know, there's a bitterness coming out of this, and there's the particularities of the Islamic faith has led them to be susceptible. So that adaptation of the trope of the Muslim threat got easily stitched onto, I say easily, but maybe not, onto the Brotherhood as a terroristic threat. And what does that do? Well, that justifies the state, the Egyptian state's violence towards the Brotherhood and anybody. I mean, we're talking about people getting arrested by a nation for less than 2 or 3 degrees of separation, being related, having the wrong type of beard, being the wrong type of place, saying the wrong type of thing, the ever increasing monitoring of social spaces. That in one sense, you know, without being somewhat facetious, you know, they'd make America proud, right? Without the pretense of protecting the citizens' rights, right? So, in one way, that attempt to justify the state's violence by making a claim that we are fighting against the violence. So that's one of the appropriations of Islamophobia. But there are other features: the construction of a liberal, religious, secular, tolerant Egypt vis-a-vis the intolerant Islamist other, and note here about the use of the state trying to defend its Coptic minority and so forth, even though one could argue that the violence towards Copts far precedes all of that if before the Brotherhood came to power, or in the idea we kind of retrospectively or regressively look back in the past and say that all forms of intolerance in Egypt can be traced back to an Ikhwani mentality. So there's an expansion here to almost scapegoat, you know, Egypt's own poor political or religious practices that often turn into violence, and label that, you know, Ikhwani, label that Brotherhood like, right? So that's another feature, kind of an erasure of a splitting, if you will, an erasure of the complexities that create intolerances within Egypt. And in that erasure, we create a simplistic split between good Muslim, bad Muslim, and the good Muslim is, of course, the liberal, the sensibly liberal, or the religious, or the secular, and any one of the Egyptian population try to fall into those categories. It's also about the mobilizing. One of the key features of Islamophobia is the way it mobilizes and aligns institutions, the military with the media, with academia, you know, like how inevitably to bring them all into alliance to speak about the threat. And one way it happens in the West, and I think this is mirrored in Egypt, is the necessity to create an alarmism, a kind of you know, a moral panic around the future of the state that can easily be both eroded and stolen by the Brotherhood if all of these institutions aren't on high alert. And Egyptian media is sometimes quite, you know, I hate to make a joke of it, but quite hilarious in its alarmism. It's like the fact that it can stipulate and make certain claims about the Brotherhood. I mean, you know, almost all things are, if you know, if the sewage is not working, it's the Brotherhood. If this electricity cut, it's almost traced always back to the idea that there's some hidden specter of the Ikhwan ultimately denying the good life or the possibility of good life for everyday Egyptians. And that alarmism inevitably gets stitched onto everyday observations of types of Islam, right? And so one of the key features of the war on terror narrative is this idea that a type of Islam. Now, this is interesting in the liberal setting, in the liberal West setting, because as I said, there's a need to maintain the symbolic gesture that the West is all about freedom, right? So you're right to practice your religion, but so how do you maintain that symbolic gesture while being fearful or constructing alarmism about Islam? And the way it typically happens is you construct types of Islam. Even in the State of Union address, 9 days after September 11, George W. Bush speaks to the idea that Al-Qaeda and those associated are betraying Islam, right? They're no friends of Allah, I think was the statement he made, right? So that construction of a good and bad Islam has always been around. And I think Egypt can try to has used that with probably far more knowledge, since Egypt is, as I said, an author of both Islamic law and Islamic history, and has a far greater and more meaningful understanding of the tradition than Bush and the States. So that attempt to construct an ideal type of Islam that sits passively or as a champion of the autocratic, the Egyptian state, was a crucial feature. So we're not denying Islam, we're denying a version of Islam that we think has brought not only us as Egyptians into—
Excuse me, Dr. Morsi, we have 5 more minutes, if
Sure.
Just letting you know.
Thank you, appreciate that. So one other feature here is the theological aspect of Islamophobia. What I mean by theological, Islamophobia is often tied as something keeping back Muslims from entering modernity. There's a lineage here that Islamophobia is all, that the world is moving closely to the political outcome, which is identified by the West. In Egypt, one of the main narratives there is that Egypt is, because of the Muslim Brotherhood mentality, stuck somewhere in pre-modern times, right? Attitudes towards women, attitudes towards minority, and it's also employed that. But due to time, I want to go now to the third part, and to return back to the question asked, how meaningful is it to say that Egyptians supporting the state can be Islamophobic? Or because why not? This is just a feature of different contexts of Islam, and that's always been the case in Egypt. Why, how, in what way can we call this contest Islamophobic? And especially one of the key features of Islamophobia is how it racializes and others. How can Muslim other Muslims? I mean, and by racializing, we're talking about everything from the way Muslims dress to what Muslims eat, to what they believe, to degrading both the institutions of the Quran and Sunnah, to belittling the Prophet ﷺ. These are key features of Islamophobia, to eradicate the pillars that produce Islamic culture. That's not happening in Egypt to an extent, right? It is at various different layers, but when it's translated to the everyday people on the street, it cannot happen, right? So my contention is part of the problems is the way we define Islamophobia, since both Islamophobia is not always simply about what is denial of rights. It's not always about a narrative. It's not always how we conceptualize the way we see Islam. A better definition, and I rely here on Salman Sayyid's use of Islamophobia, that I think can bring both the liberal and the illiberal state into conversation about what Islamophobia is the idea that Islamophobia should be seen on a spectrum. And it's fundamentally, its core feature is about erasure, the ability to erase Islam. Now, at its extremists, Sayyid would argue that erasure is through genocide. We see that in various places around the world. And that is to try to get rid of Muslims, to remove them from the earth, basically. At the less extreme end, we may find a more tolerant variants of it is to tailor, to pressure Muslims through various different social techniques and public discipline, to tailor their Islam so it is denied, if you will, its capacity to mobilize and organize, so Islamophobia here becomes, we accept Muslims but don't take in Islam beyond a particular parameter. It can't become political. It's deeply private. It's about your own private practice and so forth. So we want to erase features of Islam, what the West deems as malignant aspects of Islam. And the most malignant threat to the state is the capacity of Islam to politically mobilize, right? To politically imagine a different future beyond the state. And that is a huge threat to a place like Egypt, because what the Ikhwan and the Brotherhood typically have is the capacity to organize, right? So historically, they could bring people together or orientate them around an idea of Islam. When we define Islamophobia as that construction or destruction of an Islam that denies a capacity to mobilize, we can, I think, then maybe bypass plenty of debates about whether Egyptians there's a narrative around Islam, an evil other, or denial of rights, and start speaking about Egypt as potentially Islamophobic based on the continual pressure, both globally and locally, to deny Muslim possibilities, Islamic possibilities, mobilizing possibilities. And I'll close there with a suspension. I'm not quite sure whether I should call Egypt Islamophobic or not. I'd lean to no, but not because of any other reason, only because I think we're in the midst of a conversation about defining what Islamophobia is. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity and the time, and I look forward to further discussion in the Q&A. Jazakallah khair wa assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Professor Morsi. I will hand it over to Professor Aktay. Professor Aktay, the floor is yours. You have 18 to 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. First, I would like to thank to all the organizers, especially to Brother Sami Al-Arian, Professor Sami Al-Arian, and to Center for Islam and Global Affairs, which have rendered this organization traditional. It made from it a traditional organization, traditional activity, which we always will remind us what we are forgetting. We will not forget about that Islamophobia or the hate of Islam or anti-Islam. I would like first, of course, to say this session is about Islamophobia in Islamic countries. Unfortunately, we always are complaining about the cases which are witnessing or which we are suffering from in the Western countries or the non-Muslim countries, which in one sense, or when it's compared to the Muslim world, it is almost to be considered as normal, because they are non-Muslim and they hate Islam, and they are reflecting all their hate or their sentiments to Islam in this way, and this Islamophobia becomes to be normalized when we think about, or when we are realizing what is happening in the Muslim world. Unfortunately, the most radical experiences, the most suffering experiences about Islamophobia are taking place in the so-called Muslim world, especially until probably 10 years ago in Turkey. Also, it was the problem, and I will mention when I talk about the Muslim world, I will contain also Turkey also. But fortunately, and thanks God, that is now about the issue of the past. But still, there are some people who are eager to reflect their phobias or their hate about some Islamic appearances or Islamic dresses, even though it is not taken directly and they are interpreting this in another way, not to be honest. Even in their hate, they are not honest. They think, oh, we are not against Islam, we are against the abuse of Islam, we are against the politicization of Islam, of the religion, etc. But anyway, at the end of the day, the bill is paid by the people, by Muslim people, by people of the Muslim countries, by absence of democracy, by tyranny, by this or another way. Of course, I should, at the beginning, I would like to warn about the terminology of phobia. The phobia is something indeed understandable in one sense, of course. It is a psychological disease, and that disease should be approached, and it is approached usually with an empathy, with an effort to understand what is the reasons, what is behind this phobia. Because if there is some phobia, the phobia is not something that to be preferred. It is not something to be. It's not a matter of choice. You are not choosing to be afraid from something. If you are being afraid, you are afraid. If you are not afraid, nobody can make you afraid. So if you are afraid from Islam, for example, there should be some reasons for why you are being afraid. Of course, what we are seeing, what we are witnessing in the world of media, in the Western media, or not only in the Western media, in all media, also in the media of Muslim world, is always every day with their publications, by their broadcasting, they are covering the Islam in a way that they are identifying the Muslim world or the Muslim people with terrorism, with violence, with etc. Of course, an ordinary person in the Western world being assaulted by such production, such industry of news, such industry of Islamophobia, of course, it's very natural to be afraid. So, to an extent, it is understandable why people are being afraid of Islamophobia, of Islam, why they are being terrorized by Islam, or by terrified by the image of Islam, especially the news on Islamic terrorism, instability in the Middle East, or the Daesh issue, or in the Western. We are preferring to say Daesh, not to say ISIL, because the ISIL is the Islamic State of Islamic State in Levant. That is Iraq and Levant. That is very senseless for us, because there is nothing in that organization or in that industry which is Islamic, and nothing, nor state. There is no state and there is no Islamic in this organization or in this activity. And when we see the ISIL industry is always working to produce this fear as a matter of industry of Islamophobia. So it is not difficult to understand the emergence of the fear from Islam, and that at that level, a phobia becomes a very innocent. But of course, what is not innocent is the production of this fear, is the provocation of this fear, or is how to make people fear of Islam. It is not innocent, of course, but at the end of the day, when you produce such things, it becomes people's Islamophobia. So I don't want to say Islamophobia, and instead of Islamophobia, we always should mention or should emphasize about the dimension of the production of fear, and this production of fear is anti-Islamic, or is hostility to Islam itself. I would like to go back to some production, some cases of production of fear, especially in the McCarthy period, for example, the fear of communism of United States of America, the fear of the Jews in Germany, for example, or in the West, in the Europe in general, the cultural revolution of Mao's China, the great fears of capitalism or counter-revolution, supporting the great cleansing operations of Stalin, the fear of the Negro in America and South Africa, the fear of Negro, why you are being afraid of Negro? Negro were the victim of yours. The Negros or the black people were the victim of the white man, but still who is being afraid is the Negro, was the Negro. That was, of course, very paradoxical. Still, now in Islamic world, who is the victim of this fear? There is a fear industry, and there is a disease or a phobia, but the victim of this phobia is not those who are being afraid. the victim of this fear or this scene in general is those who are being afraid. That is interesting irony. It is tragical irony. Humanity, of course, in all these examples, in America and South America, when I say the fear of Negro from Negro was in America and South Africa resulted in the great discrimination. In all these examples, fear is employed as instrument for the elite domination, but in turn, also convincing the masses through conspiracy theories, it worked as a mass ideology. Anti-Semitism had brought about the emergence of human tragedy through the creation of a fear from the Jews. Humanity has paid the cost of the fascism, prepared and elaborated by this fear by the life of several millions of Jews and about 30 millions of other people. So there has been elaborated a sensitivity in Europe against the fears that might surrounding the political sphere. In all the mentioned examples, it has been seen clearly that no one of the object of the fear had the potential to produce any threat to those who were afraid. However, it has been proved that these fears have been employed as reasons to exclude some people from their human rights, to realize systematical discriminative policies against them. Therefore, after a long and rich period of experience, it has been agreed that such fears are either psychological diseases or phobias. Phobia is a disease, no doubt, that should be rehabilitated and should be precluded from dominating the political or social spheres, or they are something produced or abused as political instrument to control the political sphere. In any case, the possibility of the revival of the fairs as political power instrument could not be excluded yet. As a matter of fact, especially in relation to the Muslims in the entire world, the political is ruled by such production of fairs. These fears are finding each other as political instruments and as psychological disease. So, sociology of fear proposed to think on the employment of fear in the political discourses as instrument. In the reality and availability of this fear, furthermore, the importance of the subject of fear, who fears, for example, is emphasized. The impact of the fear on the object who is being afraid and on the one who is afraid should be always distinguished, since, as it is told, when the one who is afraid is in power or is the dominant major part of the society, then the possibility of the emergence of systematic human rights violations, discriminations based on that fear is quite higher and higher. That is indeed when the fear becomes the instrument of power. The fear becomes the instrument of the power who are in power. That creates very systematic human rights violations or violations of human rights and torture and massacres, everything. That is a tragical irony. And I would like to come back to the Islamism or the Islamophobia or the hate of Islam in Muslim world. Indeed, what we are seeing is it should be go back to the colonization time and the colonization of the Muslim world. After this colonization of the Muslim world, which is not secret for nobody, we see the Muslim world has been colonized, and after this decolonization, some so-called decolonization also took place, but that decolonization process didn't take place in heart or in essence, but only in form. It looks like the colonizers has left the countries, but there remained, or there were left some proxies for themselves. And what was expected from these proxies in the Muslim world in general was the Islamization of the public sphere, or the political sphere, or the Islamization of the political instrument in general. The Islamization is very interesting, and the ideology or the complementary ideology and other institutions to this, the Islamization also brought to the packet. And we saw in Muslim world many measures were taken against the public appearance of Islam. We call this, I think, Kemalism, which was applied, which was practiced in Turkey, was the ultimate or the most sophisticated form of this, the Islamization. It came to be applied as cleansing Islam from all public and political spheres. What we witnessed during the first and second stage of the Republic was completely such a way of, such a sort of war against Islam in a Muslim country. After decolonization of a country, that was the irony, that was the tragedy in Turkish case especially. And after the war of liberation was won by Turkish groups, and we saw the same, the Islamization program has been applied in Turkey, which declared a war against all Islamic symbols, from the alphabets of Arabic alphabets to the Quranic courses or the religious education and etc. And also to the hijab, or the Islamic headscarves also was prohibited in the public sphere, in universities, and this was gradually was applied and was practiced in Turkey for decades. Just and even in the time of AK Party, which is now in ruling the country since 19 years, at the first half of this party, the rule of this party, we couldn't we couldn't realize the emancipation of the Muslim world or the Muslimness in general. I mean, and there was still some restrictions on the headscarves in the public space, and that was indeed completely an Islamophobic action, Islamophobic behavior. I mean, to prohibit an Islamic symbol from the public sphere, to declare a war against it, to struggle against this, to strive for eliminating it from the public sphere, from society in general, from the political, was taking place in Turkey. That was Islamophobia indeed, and unfortunately, for the sake of these Islamophobic values, we saw even some attempts of coup d'etat took place also. The coup d'etat in 1997. It was the 28th February coup d'etat, took place just for the sake of protecting the secularism from the reactionary people. That was the name. That was the way of the discourse. This Islamophobia was legitimizing itself. Indeed, it was illegitimate. Indeed, it was Islamophobic, and it was a crime against humanity. It was a crime against Islam. But of course, in a Muslim society, even Islamophobia needs to be legitimized. And in order to legitimize this Islamophobia, there was some pretext which were introduced to the society, saying that, oh, we are not against Islam. We are against the Islamic politicization of Islam. We are against those people who abuse the Islam for the sake of their political.
Excuse me, Professor Aktay, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, that was the case which was taking place in Turkey, and in Turkey, Muslim people suffered. And another very, very tragic irony was that those people who couldn't accomplish their education career, they had to go to some European countries like Austria, which is now now among the champions of Islamophobia, to France, to Britain, to United States, to Germany, to complete their education, and they found there a sort of asylum, educational asylum there, and they created a sort of diaspora, Muslim diaspora in the Western countries. That was the item. When we are talking about Islamophobia, of course, we should always take into consideration this aspect of Islamophobia also. Of course, we are coming to Muslim world in general. Even in our time, in the days, in the coup d'etat atmosphere of Turkey against Islam, we were witnessing and we were hearing every day about the competence, the compatibility of democracy and Islam, and Muslims were pushed to a defense on themselves that they are not against democracy, or whether Islam and democracy is compatible. Of course, that was when we were hearing this, we were thinking that, oh, the Western world are caring about the democratization of our countries. That was good in one sense, of course. That was sounding very good, because we were thinking that the Western countries are caring about the development of democracy in our countries. But when something happened, of course, we saw that there was nothing sincere in this questioning, in this way of discussing about the absence or the existence of democracy in our countries. Just on the contrary, we saw that we also were witnessing that in Muslim countries, there is a solidarity between the tyrants and the Western countries about the absence of democracy. And we saw democracy from our point of view, the Turkish Muslim people also, we were very successful in making the emergence or the synthesis of the Islamic ideas, Islamic political ideas and democratic ideas. And we in one sense, we attempt to create a sort of Muslim democratic political movements in Turkey. And there was no problem with us. But that was, of course, the problem we were hearing from some radical Islamic groups, Islamist groups, some discourses against democracy, just surprising us. Indeed, we were surprised about that, and we were disappointed about this discourse, why a radical Muslim movement is against democracy. In Muslim world, there is nothing democratical. Why you are against democracy? And if there was, for example, full of democracy in our country and some problems which are suffered by the Muslim people or the Islamist people is because of that democracy. I mean, rise of democracy. That should be understandable, but there was nothing democratical in our world. Why Islamist groups, for example, in Saudi Arabia are against democracy? If they are against democracy, they are with the tyrants, with the dictators of their countries. In Egypt, for example, we were witnessing some Muslim people, Islamist political actors are raising flags against democracy. Why? Is there very a lot of democracy in your country? So it is so much democracy that is suffering you. No, what is suffering you? What is upsetting you is not democracy. It is the absence of democracy. So that was the shape. But that fear of Islam, that fear of democracy was provoked, was nurtured by, was being fed by the Islamic, not to say so-called Islamic discourse of the Gulf countries, unfortunately. And we saw these countries were creating, were provoking, or were encouraging the discourses against democracy on the name of Islam. Of course, this was a distortion of Islam indeed, because that fear, and in the name of this fear of that's discourses against democracy in the name of Islam. Behind that, there was in return there was coming the Islamophobia against political Islam, to be against politicization of Islam in general. And now, just to summarize and to go fast in this, because there is no time to go in detail about that, what we are witnessing in the Muslim world, unfortunately, what we saw, all Muslim movements, Islamic movements in the world are being hindered by some Gulf countries, especially by Emirates or Saudi Arabia. They are against all political Islamic movements. For example, we saw any coup d'etat or coup d'etat attempt against any Islamic democratic party, behind it is Saudi Arabia, for example. They supported the coup d'etat against the democratic Islamic movement in Algiers. They supported all the counter revolutions in the Muslim world in the Arab Spring period. All were democratic. They all were representing the will of people, and the will of people was very good. And again, at the end of the day, they created and they committed some crimes against humanity. They committed crimes against democracy. They committed all the crimes against humanity by sharing crime against the massacres in Egypt, for example, in the Rabia Straits, and the counter revolutions or the coup d'etats were against the will of people, and they were crime. There was a criminal aspect in this, a critical dimension in this. But this, at the end of the day, instead of paying some excuse for the people, for the Muslim world, we saw that, or a sort of Islamophobia. And Ikhwan was the responsible of all what happening, because they said Ikhwan is terrorist. Ikhwan is the responsible or in charge of all what happened in this Muslim world. Especially, I say this. I think they wish that Ikhwan would be a terrorist. If Ikhwan was terrorist, they would be very, very happy. They will be more happier than now, because if Ikhwan was a terrorist, it would be easier to cope with the threat it is creating them, because the fear of Islamophobia or the fear of Ikhwan is not the fear of Ikhwan. Indeed, it is the fear of democracy. Because Ikhwan,
Akhtar, if I could ask you to conclude.
Ikhwan is synonymous of democracy in the Muslim world, and not because they are terrorists, but because they remind them the possibility of a willing society, a willing people. And a willing people is by itself very, very big threat for them. They perceive in it, they have a perception of threat from that willing people. Indeed, if they think more seriously, if they think more beneficial, it is not, of course, fear for anybody. It is just for the benefit of all the Muslim world in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Akhtar. My apologies for having to cut you off, but it's in the interest of all the other participants. We next have Professor Al-Azmi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just share my screen so that I can give a presentation. So I have a sort of Google Slides presentation. So I hope that you will be able to sort of see this in just a moment. Please let me know if you can see this.
Yep, we see it.
Excellent. So I'm discussing, I've been asked to talk about sort of the role of the ulama. And I'm particularly interested in the role of state-sponsored ulama in promoting Islamophobia. And it's really been a pleasure in an unusual way, because we're talking about something which isn't terribly pleasant, to sort of think about the question of Islamophobia as it pertains to sort of states in the region. And so this is quite appropriate, I think, for sort of this presentation to be looking at some of the instruments used by these states in promoting Islamophobia. I'm not going to parse the question of Islamophobia quite as much as I thought that was a very thoughtful reflection from Yasser Mursi. But I'm going to basically look at certain scholars and the way in which they talk about Islam. And a lot of the time, the way in which they talk about Islamophobia actually manifests its harms in Western contexts as well. And we'll consider how the states sort of employ a certain type of discourse that helps promote that kind of Islamophobia in the West, but also deploys scholars for that purpose. And I've just got on the screen sort of 3 scholars. 2 of them are particularly notable, an Egyptian and a Yemeni. And this is a figure from the United Arab Emirates. Ali Gum'a is a former sort of Grand Mufti of Egypt, and he would be sort of Sisi's favorite candidate to replace Ahmed al-Tayyib as the Sheikh al-Azhar. But Sheikh al-Azhar is currently in place, and it's beyond the power of Sisi to remove him, according to the Egyptian constitution, as far as I understand. And this is Ali al-Jifri, who is a relatively young scholar. You could say more of a preacher than a scholar. He's not respected as a jurist in the way that someone like Gom'a would be, but extremely sort of influential in the social media sphere and the media sphere more generally. Even though he's Yemeni, he's based in the United Arab Emirates, and he frequently sort of engages in Egypt as well. And so I wanted to sort of talk about the way in which the United Arab Emirates and in Egypt in particular, they are in a sense instrumentalized for the purpose of sort of, in a sense, promoting a kind of Islamophobia that is useful to the state. So I'm sort of, this is an article from a couple of years ago now in Foreign Policy, which described Arab regimes as the world's most powerful Islamophobes by Ola Salim and Hassan Hassan. And one of the things they say is Arab regimes spend millions of dollars on think tanks, academic institutions, and lobbying firms, in part to shape the thinking of Western capitals about domestic political activists opposed to their rule, many of whom happen to be religious. And the sort of most, in my view, the most influential regime to do this in Western capitals, whether it's in Washington, DC, David spoke very thoughtfully about the influence in Britain, but actually in DC, of course, they have Yusuf al-Utaiba, who is arguably one of the most influential sort of ambassadors in the history of, in the recent history of the United States. And he is the UAE ambassador to DC. And through him, they have managed to place immense pressure on sort of, I think, politicians, and sort of gentle pressure and a kind of whining and dining pressure that helps co-opt US politicians to the UAE's perspective on who should be considered to be a threat, a terrorist threat and the like. And of course, we've been speaking about terrorism and the war on terror. That entire discursive context that emerges most sort of stridently after 9/11, 20 years ago now, is of course the context in which these sorts of weaponized narratives about Muslims are particularly potent. I'm going to try to see if I can play this clip. If you can't hear me, please let me know. Or if there is sort of any sound duplication.
Make sure you share your computer audio.
Yes, I have done that. So let me see if this works. If it doesn't, I can just explain the narrative. So this is from 2017, the United Arab Emirates, Abdullah bin Zayed. So he's the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates, and the brother of the ruler, or the de facto ruler, as well as the actual ruler. So the de facto ruler being Mohammed bin Zayed, who's in a sense the spearhead behind a lot of this. So let's hear what he has to say about European Muslims and the threat that they pose. Oh, sorry, that didn't work. Let me see if I try this now. Sorry.
Translation, but I just want to make.
Apologies. Let me try once more. And
there will come a day that we will see far more radical extremists and terrorists coming out of Europe because of the lack of decision making, trying to be politically correct, or assuming that they know the Middle East and they know Islam and they know the others far better than we do. And I'm sorry, but that's pure ignorance.
So the point of this is to illustrate how, in a sense, figures like this, who, of course, as David pointed out, they can actually wield considerable power over Western capitals like London, for example, through the sorts of contracts that they have the power to buy from Western military government, Western governments and military industrial complexes, very costly military hardware that is these Western states are desperate to sell to make money, so to speak. But in that process, they can basically impose upon them certain conditionalities. In DC, it works slightly different, as David was pointing out, but in a place like the UK, that sort of, it can be quite heavy-handed. And you could see the language of terrorism saying, look, you're incubating these vast numbers of Muslims, and they basically are a terrorist threat, and you need to sort of keep them under control. You need to surveil them and control them in various sorts of ways. And I'll get back to why exactly this is the case. But in the next clip, I'm not going to play that clip just for want of time. But the next clip is a few years earlier. This was from 2017, and the present clip is from 2014. And if anyone wants to watch it afterwards, please let me know. But in a 2014 Fox News interview, he described, the Fox News interviewer was basically saying, well, you characterized CARE and the Muslim American Society, two sort of well-established organizations in North America, one of them very active, CARE in particular, in lobbying for Muslim interests in the country, very often very benign interests. And they've been labeled as terrorist organizations. This is going back 7 years now. And speaking to a right-wing news show, Abdullah bin Zayed is basically portraying the West as soft on terrorists. And he says, we have a very low bar for terrorism. We're going to sort of make sure that even the slightest manifestation of terrorism and incitement and these sorts of things are going to be things we treat very seriously. And, he's speaking to Fox News. In a sense, that's the sort of audience where people will think, yeah, this is very reasonable. And it's coming from someone who is a ruler in the Middle East, and obviously they know what they're talking about. As you saw in the last clip, he was saying, well, you can't say that you know these circumstances better than we do. And of course, what's the purpose of all of this? In a sense, it's not in a sense, it's quite obviously to keep at bay the democratic tendencies of the sorts of people that they are labeling terrorists. So they're labeling terrorists people who are advocating for democracy in the region, and democracy is a genuine threat. It does, in a sense, terrorize the ruling class of the United Arab Emirates, because they fear for their own sort of privileges. And
you're taking a leadership.
And so let's now talk a bit about the scholars. And I realized I should have also included a clip from Ali Al-Jifri, and I'll come back to that point perhaps towards the end of the sort of presentation if I have the time. But this is, this is a fascinating image. It's got a lot of people who are, in a sense, very problematic in terms of the scholars in this picture. This is Abdullah bin Bayya. This is Shawqi Allam, who we'll see in a moment. Shawqi Allam is the sort of current Mufti of Egypt, Grand Mufti of Egypt. Abdullah bin Bayya is a very respected jurist who is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Mauritania back in the 70s. And he's been based in sort of Saudi Arabia since around that time. They were overthrown in a coup and he left, and he's been based in Saudi Arabia as a teacher at King Abdulaziz University. But in recent years, basically since 2013, when he was associated closely with Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he disassociated from Qaradawi and basically tied his camel to the United Arab Emirates. And has become an integral part of the UAE's soft power infrastructure. So he's currently he set up in 2014 the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, what I've put here as FPPMS, and the Muslim Council of Elders. The Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, it sounds like a lovely sort of very cuddly project, but it's basically about the promotion of Islamophobia. He's additionally, in the last couple of years, been appointed as the Grand Mufti of the United Arab Emirates. And so he is basically sort of the equivalent of a minister within the United Arab Emirates. And in that capacity, he has been remarkably prolific in his, what I would argue are his Islamophobic pronouncements. So he has designated the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, I think in the last 6 months. In the last 12 months, he has declared the person who is kissing him is Mohammed bin Zayed. He is the spearhead of all of the counter-revolutionary efforts in the Middle East. And David Kirkpatrick of the New York Times wrote an article about a year and a half ago, perhaps, saying that the most powerful person in the Middle East isn't MBS. Everyone talks about Mohammed bin Salman. It's actually MBZ. It's this guy, and he's very sort of subtle, and he's very discreet, but he's very effective. And he basically is showing here sort of his closeness to Abdullah bin Bayya. And essentially, Abdullah bin Bayya in the last year, he basically ratified the UAE's normalization with Israel, something which very few scholars, well, basically no scholars that I know of, aside from those who are closely aligned with states and usually are on their payroll, have signed off on. But he is a heavyweight as a scholar and a jurist. And so in a sense, despite his being in the sort of service of the United Arab Emirates, it is a severe blow to sort of intellectual arguments against, or Islamic scholarly arguments against that sort of a move on the part of the United Arab Emirates, although it has been roundly condemned across the board. But what is particularly interesting for me in Abdullah bin Bayya's sort of discourse is he actually has developed relatively elaborate juristic arguments to basically justify absolute obedience to an autocrat. And he basically says autocratic rulers cannot be, no checks can be placed on autocratic rulers on Islamic grounds. And I think that really places him at the pinnacle of the scholars that we're talking about in terms of those who are in some respects or in some capacity promoting Islamophobia. The next scholar, you'll notice he was standing in the background here, and here he is in the foreground, of course, is Shawqi Allam, the current Mufti of Egypt, or Grand Mufti of Egypt, if you will. And in 2020, he made a remark. So, roughly.
Dr. Al-Azmi, you have 5 more minutes.
Yes, I've got a time, so that's fine. So in 2020, scarcely 6 months ago, he was talking on an Egyptian show on the question of ISIS, and a throwaway remark almost, but actually not altogether throwaway remark, because he says, we researched the question of ISIS in great detail. And so he says here, we studied the issue in 2016 and found that the number of Europeans got to a point where about 50% of the second and third generation Muslims living in Europe had joined ISIS, which is an absolutely absurd and insanely, that would be sort of probably several factors greater than the actual number of people living under ISIS at the time in Syria, given the significant number of Muslims in Europe. But, this is the sort of narrative that is purveyed by someone who, of course, he's been the person appointed to the position of the Grand Mufti in 2013. And when the Sisi regime came into, through the coup in July of 2013, this was the scholar who signed off on all of the death sentences against the various members of the Muslim Brotherhood who'd been imprisoned because they were calling for democratic reform in the region, and they were protesting the coup. But another point I want to just highlight is figures like this Abdullah bin Bayya, Allam, and a couple of the other figures that I will mention in a moment are, in a tragicomic sort of sense, are also people who are presenting themselves as being at the forefront of fighting ISIS. So I want to switch briefly to a sort of website which many people will be familiar with. This is the website Open Letter to Baghdadi, and it's known as lettertobaghdadi.com. And it's an interesting, elaborate sort of discussion about how Baghdadi, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the now deceased head of ISIS, former head of ISIS, is completely against Islamic values. And this website which was signed by hundreds of scholars, this letter, it's being headlined by precisely these scholars: Abdullah bin Bayya, Shawqi Allam, Ali Gum'a, who is the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, who we'll talk about very briefly, Hamza Yusuf Hansen, a student of Abdullah bin Bayya. And the first four, in a sense, are the ones I wanted to highlight. I'm just going to try and conclude as in the next couple of minutes, but I think what's important here is to recognize these are all integrated methods of weaponizing Islamic knowledge on the part of quote unquote scholars who are close to states, who are going to basically ratify whatever these states do. And Ali Gum'a is perhaps the most striking of these scholars who I've encountered in the sort of post-Arab Spring context. In 2013, he called the Muslim Brotherhood Khawarij, which is a very theologically loaded way of calling people rebels and terrorists and things like that. You can see he's giving a lecture here just after he had actually spoken to the Egyptian army, telling to shoot to kill sort of opponents of the coup. And on the screen it says Egypt under attack, and in Arabic it says Misr tuharib al-irhab. So the entire narrative, which means Misr is waging war against terrorism. So the entire narrative is deeply baked into the sort of post 9/11 war on terror narrative. I will cover this very briefly. This is a student of Ali Gum'a. His name is Osama Sayyid, and he's an advisor, official advisor to Sisi, the sort of the coup leader of Egypt since 2013. And they write, in a sense, a scholarship that justifies their sort of perspectives. Just to conclude in less than a minute, in a sense, we have a problematic question which has been sort of reflected on by some of the earlier speakers. Can Muslims be Islamophobic? And what I want to say is, Arab autocrats like the ones we've seen and the scholars who are, who are on their payrolls do not hate Islam per se. They hate the threat to, the Arab autocrats hate the threat to their absolute power. And so there is a true existential threat that comes from Islamic orientations that demand accountable and democratic government. And so Islamophobia is a highly expedient tool for opposing democratic Islamists in particular. And I just want to conclude with that. I hope this has been a useful reflection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Azmi, for that brilliant presentation. I hope that we can see some of those sources that you mentioned, if you could pass those along. I'd invite all of the participants to open their cameras. We have a number of, can you hear me? Sometimes my mic doesn't work that well.
You're a little quiet, but we can hear you. Yeah.
Is this better?
Yeah. That sounds good to me.
I'll speak up a little bit so that you can hear me better. We have a number of questions from the participants and people who are listening live on Facebook. I have a couple of questions of my own, and we don't have much time, so if I could request most of you to be brief in your answers, as poignant as possible. I know that it's a complex topic. My first question is in regards to Islamic Democrats. So one of the oddities of the development of what we call Islamic movements in the Muslim world is that it went from as if you've read March's recent book, that it went from both in the sense of the Khilafat movement and the Pan-Islamic movement under Abdul Hamid II, it went from a appeal for, I wouldn't say autocracy, but monarchy. I mean, it was an appeal for monarchical rule in the form of the Khilafat. And then around the 50s or 60s, both in terms of the formation of Pakistan on the one hand, and then also the formation of multi-party rule in other parts of the Muslim world, it turned into a democratic movement. So there is a little bit of a question as to how Islamic really these movements are and how political they are. So maybe you know, this is to all the panelists about this kind of very strange turn of events, right? The people who now are talking about democracy come from a root of people who are actually arguing for monarchy. Number two is, and there's a number of inconsistencies there. I mean, the cooperation with Saudi Arabia in the 70s against Nasser, there's a lot of, and then the Qatar monarchy is another issue there. I mean, so there's a backing of Bahrain against the Shiites. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there that maybe we can talk about. Number two is the racialization of Muslims and the role Islamism has played in that racialization. So if we look at, for instance, Devji's work or Aidan's work recently, who have argued that appeals to the Muslim world as a territory or a context in which Islamist action will be taking place or Muslim politics will take place, was actually first and foremost the first racialization of Muslims to begin with, was done by Islamists, right? To bring Muslims into a single group for the purpose of political action. So there's a number of issues there that we have to discuss in order to clarify how, in fact, the Muslim political actors, because so far we've talked about the Brotherhood, is that how their role in perpetuating the situation right now, is there any? Number one. To Mr. To Dr. Miller, there's a couple of questions here. I'm just going to say all the questions, and then we're going to go one by one, and everybody will answer their questions, and then we'll close because I don't want to go over time. So I'm going to put all the questions out there, and then you can pick up and you can make your comments accordingly. So Professor Miller, there was a question about what's the role, how do you see the role of the UAE in its relationship with India vis-a-vis the Islamophobic tendencies of the Indian government, especially in terms of the question of Kashmir? It seems like the UAE has played a pretty prominent role against Kashmir and in favor of India. How that's one question. Another question to you was, what are the real reasons of the UAE in its zealousness to go after Islamic groups throughout the world? Is there a geopolitical alliance between UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US against Islamic groups and other regional powers such as Turkey and Iran? To Professor Al-Azmi and Professor Akhtai, can you please give your assessment of the policies of Saudi Arabia in the context of Islamophobia, so particularly on Saudi Arabia? And then there is another question to the panel more generally. Oh, wait, 1 second, let me make sure I'm trying to get all these in here. Okay, this is to all the panelists, so you can comment on this as well. Why is there a symbiotic relationship between autocratic regimes in Muslim majority countries and Islamophobia? Oh, so, and also as well as democratic regimes in non-Muslim countries, particularly in the West. How do we explain that? So meaning, I think the question is, if we have autocracy and democracy, we still see Islamophobia. So it's not like if we get rid of the autocracy in Muslim majority countries, that will guarantee some kind of non-Islamophobic future. What about Muslim majority countries? Okay, that one's not a really useful question. The question is perhaps, are they in Muslim majority countries really afraid of Islam, or do they actively antagonize and fight without fearing it? I think this is to Professor Akhtai, because he was talking about fear and phobia as a useful way of defining what's going on. So I guess
what was the question? What was the question? Can you repeat?
In Muslim majority countries, are they really afraid of Islam, or do they just simply antagonize it and fight it, and there's no real fear there? That's what he's asking. The phobia, the term phobia is not really a proper term. Another one to Professor Akhtai is, many thanks for your talk. My questions are as follows. Why do you think some Muslim countries are against fair elections in their countries? Why do you think imperial powers do not interfere in such countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt? What about powers behind Saudi Arabia? When it comes to the enmity towards discrete Muslims there? I don't really understand the last part of that question, so we can just ignore it. and this is to Professor Azmi. Thanks for your talk. Why do you think UAE acts in such a way? I guess this is a general question. And then lastly to you also, what do you think about prudential scholars that are under the control of the state? Why do you think they surrender to leaders of their countries when it comes to tell the truth? Okay, so that's all of the questions. I think one by one, and everybody's mics can go off, and we should have an open discussion for the last 20 minutes here. But I'll just go one by one, and I'll start with Professor Miller, and then feel free to interject if you want to add a comment. I'm not going to ask anybody else to add a comment onto what he said, but if you feel like there's something you want to add, jump in and add, and then we'll go to one by one everybody. So Professor Miller, please.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, the question about India and the UAE, yes, of course, there's an alliance there between the Hindutva's, the BJP, and the UAE, and indeed, of course, the Israelis. Very strong alliance there, military alliance as well as ideological alliance. And you can see it in the UK, for example, where the mobilization of a right-wing Hindu vote in the UK's last election, which was done in the same kind of way as there was the mobilization of right-wing Zionists to vote against the Labour Party. That was a difficult thing to do. So there's very much an alliance there between the UAE and Israel and that faction, which is in control in India and which runs parts of India. And we'll see much more of that, and we'll see much more of that being mobilized in expatriate communities across the world, where the significant Hindu populations who can be mobilized to take politics in a particular election. I think that's an alliance. It's clearly an alliance with Zionists, with Israelis, and indeed with the UAE, and of course, too. Is that a geopolitical alliance? Yes, it is, of course. I mean, India is an emerging part of that. And you can see also that the other countries becoming, linked in with that, like for example, Brazil. But yes, as I mentioned before, the tripartite alliance between the UAE, kind of an elite, and the Saudis and the Israelis, much a thing, and very much about trying to influence politics in their own countries, but also in other countries too. So that there's a huge effort in the UK, as people have said in other countries, to try and normalize Zionism within especially minority ethnic communities, especially in Muslim communities, but also in Hindu communities too. And that's done by a variety of techniques through interfaith work. And Osama, your work on the clerics and the scholars, I mean, it's obviously crucially important here. And I was very pleased to hear some of the stuff you were talking about, some of which I didn't know about. And there's a lot of that stuff going on, which has ramifications not just in the UAE and in the Middle East, but in Western countries too. And so that is a big thing which we should be studying much more in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Professor Miller. I'd like to move to Dr. Morsi. The question that I raised earlier about racialization, I think that you might be more knowledgeable enough to answer that because of your work. How do we square this idea that racialization of Muslims was actually the product of Islamist politics? I mean, this is the claim that is made by some people who have studied modern movements, right? So the idea that Muslims have a political identity that is separate from other political concerns, and that those should be brought together under one umbrella, erasing the differences, creedal, spiritual, legal, and try to bring it around an identity, right? This is the claim of people like Devji or Aydin, whose recent work comes to my mind. How do we square that with the racialization that we now see, right, through Islamophobic discourses both in the West and in Muslim majority countries?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I guess the heart of it is a contest about what we mean by racialization. From what your question is stating, I gather the authors are using racialization to essentially mean a reduction or a construction of a singular type of identity that captures one feature, and in the process of doing that construction, it erases diversity, complexities, and contests that are both historically natural and part and parcel of the contest of becoming and being Muslim. In that way, whether I give a definitive answer to square in it, whether it is an Islamist project or otherwise, I can maybe towards the back end of my response speak about kind of this, for lack of a better term, the strategic essentialism that certain resistance and revolutionary Islamist or otherwise groups use in order to mobilize as one feature of it. But I want to begin by saying racialization is often a product of power. So, in order to be able to successfully racialize an identity and make it something that has the capacity to mobilize and organize people, there needs to be some type of power behind it, some type of institutional and cultural power behind it. So it's important to keep that in mind, that when we typically, at least in the field that I do most of my work, speak about racialization, we are speaking about the way a majority group racializes a minority in being able to create an identity that kind of ideal Muslim, an ideal other, right? And they employ an assemblage of various different things, not just the biological, but of course the cultural, and I think in this sense, when we speak about Islamists potentially racializing a Muslim identity, they will, I think, be employing variants of Islam that sits with their political projects. Now, I'm somewhat uneasy, but I want to give with the question, because I'm not quite sure racializing is the right word, but I take into consideration that there is in the Islamist project an attempt to erase complexities. And that brings me back to my initial concept that I borrowed from Spivak, for instance, about this strategic essentialism, where we try, in order to mobilize something, we create one feature. And often it's a feature that is denied by the powers to be or the context to be. So it's kind of like a return of something repressed. So because of the ongoing need to repress the political aspect of Islam by various different regimes, this return of the politicization of Islam could be a retaliatory or reactive comment. But,
thank you so much. The strategic essentialism is a very important concept here to see if it can apply. I think that's a really insightful way of thinking about it, maybe, and making sense of that. I want to bring in Professor Al-Azmi on this question, especially in terms of like South Asia, like the racialization of Muslims there is an example. I mean, Bangladesh's split from Pakistan was a kind of a clear statement that the politics of creating a racial political project of Muslims was not taking into consideration very essential differences of, like, for instance, Bangladeshis as a group within the project. So maybe you can comment on that.
Thank you. I mean, I must sort of put front and center that I'm not a race theorist, and so I'm not sort of particularly well versed in the literature in this regard, but I have read Aidan's work, and I have read some of my colleague Faisal Devji's work on these sorts of issues. So, and Faisal is obviously writing very often looking at South Asia. Aidan is looking very much at the sort of, I think, he's doing a global history in his book, The Idea of the Muslim World. But I actually very strongly disagree with his reading of The Idea of the Muslim World. Unfortunately, both Aidan and Devji aren't sort of, Arabic isn't one of the languages that they engage in. And by doing so, in the case of Aidan, whose work in this regard I'm more familiar with, just the excising of Arabic literatures from this debate, and the fact that he doesn't go any further back than I think the 18th century at the earliest, completely sort of denies the fact that there's actually a very strong consciousness of Muslim identity, in a sense of an imagined community, you could argue, that goes back, into the earliest centuries of the Islamic sort of project, as it were. So I think that, in a sense, the racialization, if it's being used in a very technical sense of racialization, then in the sense that Yasser just mentioned, I can't necessarily comment on that. But the sense of forming an identity as Muslim, to use the term somewhat anachronistically, forming an ethnic identity in sort of the early centuries of Islam, from 7th century Arabia onwards, I think that's, very clear in the writings of the Quran and the Hadith, and the sort of early engagements of scholars from that point onwards. This, of course, does lend itself to problematic forms of essentialism potentially, I don't want to necessarily sort of posit, problematically essentialist readings of what it is to be a Muslim. But I thought that was something that needed to be said in terms of the historical depth of the question is, in my estimation, not really explored by the two scholars you mentioned.
While we have you on the mic, would you like to comment on some of the questions that were posed to you?
I feel sort of like I'd be jumping the queue. I'd love for Professor Akhtar to sort of have his chance, and I don't mind sticking around towards later on. That's
okay.
it.
Okay, Professor Akhtar, would you like to make some comments about
Thank you.
That were posed to you?
There are some questions, especially is there any assessment about Saudi Arabia's Islamophobic behaviors or attitudes? Of course, apparently Saudi Arabia is an Islamic country, and it is caring about the Islamic heritage, especially in Mecca, in Medina, and in Kaaba, and it is protecting, or it is taking care of protecting all these heritage, architectural or historical heritage. But of course, what I say about Saudi Arabia's Islamophobia is not, of course, directly or targeting Islam, of course. It is about the influence. When we see, for example, Saudi Arabia's policy in the world is very, very secularist indeed, radically secularist. It has nothing to do with caring about Islam, and it has nothing, for example, one expect from Saudi Arabia, for example, to be caring about those people, the victims of Islamophobia, Islamophobic actions or movements in the West, for example. We don't see anything like this, but we see everywhere. For example, the Zain al-Abidin bin Ali was fighting against all Islamic symbolisms or Islamic appearance in the public sphere, and when he was revolted by the democratic revolution in Tunisia, he had a flee. He had flee from Tunisia to Saudi Arabia, and he had found an asylum, even though Saudi Arabia normally is not a normal country, a usual refugee country, but she accepted some like dictators who were fighting against Islam in their countries. Actually, of course, there are some difference between the people who the kings or some bureaucrats in Saudi Arabia in general, but unfortunately, we don't see any sensitivity for taking care of the Muslims in the world. There is a symbiotic relationship between autocratic regimes of the Muslim world and the democratic regimes of the Western world. That is very, very, very apparent. When we see, I wrote a book inspired from Karl Popper's book about the open society and its enemies. And I said, as a reaction to those who were questioning about the absence of democracy in the Muslim world, I reacted that let's look at who is the who is the enemy of democracy in the Muslim world. Are really the Islamists or the Islamic movements, or are some that just I mentioned, and I tried to draw attention to this symbiotic relationship, especially
would you say that Khashoggi,
for example,
would you say Saudi Arabia's attack on Khashoggi was also a form of
sorry?
The attack on Khashoggi that happened in Turkey, was this a symbol of this kind of autocratic behavior?
Of course, this is all these behaviors have nothing to do with Islam. They are all against Islam because they don't follow any principle of Islam, neither in the lifestyle, neither in caring of the poor people, because the wealth which is held by Saudi Arabia, by the regime or by the rich people of Saudi Arabia, is enough to feed all the hungry people in the world, especially in the Muslim world. But this is against Islam if it's not if against the Islamic principle, and we don't see any trace of Islamic principles in these behaviors, of course. And also we see the hostility to all Islamic movements and all democratic movements in the Muslim world in general. I mean, and this is also they are for example, they are supporting all the autocratic regimes in the Muslim world, but they are against the democratic regions, which is reflection of the people, of the Muslim people's will. So I don't, of course, not to say symbolically of they are nominally against Islam, or they are nominally Islamophobe, but in principle they are against democracy. And this the Ikhwan movements, there is a sort of demonization of Ikhwan and the Ikhwanophobia, if not Islamophobia, Ikhwanophobia, but Ikhwan means it is the most moderate and the most popular movement, most popular Muslim religious movement in the Muslim world. Why this hostility to that movement? I mean, it is very difficult to understand that, other than applying to a sort of Islamophobic reactions or Islamophobic motivations. Of course, this symbiotic, I say, what is the enemies of democracy? Democracy and its enemies in the Muslim world. If we follow up this, we found out a symbiotic relationship between the autocratic regimes and the democratic regimes of the democratic regimes of the West. That is very paradoxical, and this very difficult combination take place in the Muslim world, unfortunately. When we saw, for example, the coup d'etat and the counter-revolutions against the Arab Spring, that means the democratic revolutions in the Muslim world, we didn't see any reaction, any serious reaction. There was some, of course, symbolic or some very weak reactions from the West, but in general, there was no problem with these countries to set their relationship, to restore their relationship with these coup d'etat countries. In Muslim majority countries, really, is there a real affair from Islam, or there is an antagonization of? Yes, it is right. There is no fear from Islam, of course. The Muslim world in general, the majority of the Muslim world are Muslim, and they are not afraid. They don't fear from Islam. But the regimes, the Kemalist regimes, I don't restrict the Kemalist regime to Turkey only, but that model, the Islamization of the public sphere, the Islamization of the social sphere, is a model for the Muslim world in general, for the self-colonization of the Muslim world in general, and which took place and which prevailed in Turkey for decades. And for decades, we saw that sort of Islamophobia, which was practiced by Kemalism, and this was fighting against Islam only because the general Muslim people, and they were fighting against the people when they were fighting against the political Islam.
Professor
And
Akhtar, if I could,
Muslim majority
Akhtar,
countries.
Professor Akhtar, I'll be the disrespectful student who asks the
Yes.
question but also doesn't listen for the answer. I mean, because in service of time, if you could make your comments a little bit more brief, and forgive me for being such a disrespectful student.
That's it. I think there was another, the last question was about the Muslim majority countries are afraid of democracy. No, there is no fear of democracy. Just on the contrary, the Muslim majority countries with autocratic regimes are, of course, not the people, but of course the regimes are afraid of democracy, and that is our reality, unfortunately, and that is also the answer for the democracy and its enemies in the Muslim world. Thank you very much.
Forgive me again. My apologies for being so obtuse. But Professor Azmi, if you could make your final comments.
Sure, Jazakumullah khair. Actually, I mean, in all these remarks, a lot of thoughts have come into my mind. So I'll try and see what I can fit in this. I wanted to look at the question of democracy briefly, democracy versus monarchy, with which you started, Owais, which is very thought-provoking in a sense. And I'd like to disagree with